Hey guys, I want to welcome you to the second invited speakers presentation of the hour. I'm pleased to announce, or at least welcome Dan Rosenheck, sports editor and business writer of The Economist here. His invited speaking talk today is entitled Keeping Him Close, the Importance of Holding Base Runners. Yeah. With that, take it away, Dan.
Thank you very much. There's not much truth to the old saw that good pitching usually beats good hitting. But there's also no doubt that with a season on the line, nothing is more valuable in baseball than a dominant starting pitcher. No other position in American team sports has nearly as much impact on the outcome of a game as a top starter, and nothing gives fans more confidence than the knowledge that their ace is on the mound. So what separates the greats from the rest? Velocity helps, to be sure. So does a wipeout breaking ball, or pinpoint command. Some pitchers have maintained success long after losing their best stuff by outsmarting hitters and keeping them off balance. There's more to being a pitcher than just pitching, of course. In the NL, pitchers hit, and the difference between having a Carlos Zambrano or Giovanni Gallardo in your lineup and an average helpless pitcher at the plate is about the same as the gap between having a superstar like Joey Votto and a bench warmer. Fielding also gets overlooked as well, even though grabbing a few extra comebackers and bunts over the course of a season can really add up. And then there's perhaps the least appreciated complementary skill of all, holding runners. If you read a scouting report, you'll find reams of information on every pitch in a hurler's arsenal, and at most a sentence or two about how he handles men already on base. Conventional wisdom holds that the best way for pitchers to stop guys from getting to second is to stop them from getting to first, and most of the credit for nabbing opposing base stealers goes to catchers. While the pickoff is one of the most exciting plays in baseball, it's too rare to leap to fans' minds when they evaluate pitchers. Yet it turns out that even in today's conservative running game, keeping would-be thieves close to first is far more important and valuable than either the media or even most statistical analysts have realized. As a fan, I didn't grow up with any particular passion personally for pitchers with killer pickoff moves. My interest in them really emerged as a byproduct of an effort that I'm sure many of you share, trying to win in fantasy baseball. I run an extremely competitive high-stakes league, and I regard first place as a birthright that is worth any sacrifice to defend. So a few years ago, I started playing around with projections for baseball player statistics, what Nate Silver, another esteemed panelist at this conference, used to do before he got famous. The simplest method of projection is to use each component statistic, like walks or home runs, to predict itself. For that, you need to know two things: how noisy the number is, meaning how much it bounces around from year to year for no good reason, and how fast it decays, or how much more to weight recent seasons than those from the further past. Anyone with access to a spreadsheet can come up with estimates for these values in about half an hour. For example, for pitchers, a statistic like strikeouts is very stable. Guys who whiff a lot of guys one year usually do so the next year as well. It's also a very what have you done for me lately kind of statistic. When you see a big move up or down in strikeout rate, it's probably for real. Data from 2 years ago has just 27% as much predictive power for strikeouts as the figure from last year, and from 3 years ago, just 7% as much. Batted ball rates, like ground balls or pop-ups, are similar to strikeouts, and there's not a lot of random fluctuation, but different in that stats from many years ago are still helpful in predicting future performance. I suspect that's because hit trajectory has more to do with the type of pitches someone throws, which tend to be stable over time, than it does with the quality of their pitches, which can improve or deteriorate faster. Finally, there are extremely noisy numbers, like the share of a pitcher's fly balls that go for homers. These technically have low decay rates, but in practice, the projection for these stats tends to be very close to the league average, and those variables represent the best opportunity to get a leg up on the competition. One of the most important discoveries in the history of baseball analysis was made more than a decade ago by Voros McCracken, who spoke at this conference last year. He was the first to notice that the top half of this chart was dominated by factors that the pitcher controlled directly, like strikeout and walk rates, while the bottom was full of data influenced by the defense, like the batting average allowed on balls in play, usually called BABIP. He presumed that the randomness of the numbers at the bottom meant that pitchers did not exert control over these variables, and invented a new form of ERA based exclusively on strikeout, walk, and home run rates, with all other stats normalized to the league average. A modern version of this number is called FIP, for fielding independent pitching. It's now widely available on the interwebs, and also forms the bedrock for most widely disseminated forecasting systems. The state of the art these days is pretty much projecting a pitcher's FIP and adjusting for his age, ballpark, and defense. I hoped I could do better. My first target was BABIP itself, which McCracken had made famous as the hardest statistic to predict. Rather than looking for clues in a pitcher's past BABIP, I chose to ignore it completely and see if any other variables might do a better job of forecasting it than it does for itself. I soon found two numbers that combined to explain the following season's BABIP quite well: a pitcher's pop-up rate and the rate that hitters swing and miss when they offer at pitches thrown in the strike zone. Together, they turned BABIP from the bane of a forecaster's existence to a merely mild headache. I gave a talk about this finding at this conference a year ago. A few weeks later, one of the freely available online forecasting systems, which is widely used by my competitors in my fantasy league, caught wind of it and incorporated it into his projections. While the author was kind enough to wait until my draft to publish his updated numbers, there would be no such courtesy in 2014. To stay ahead of my rivals, I would need a new edge. There are two steps between FIP and ERA. The first, of course, is the gap between a pitcher's BABIP and the league average. But once we plug in the BABIP and we know how many hits, homers, walks, and outs a pitcher has, we still don't know how those events were distributed. A guy who gives up 9 singles in the first inning and then retires 27 straight will allow at least 6 runs, whereas one who gives up 1 single and nothing else in each inning pitches a shutout. FIP, along with its more sophisticated cousins, assumes that this sequencing is random and clumps them together at a league average rate. They determine this frequency with a statistical tool called a run estimator. By comparing the runs scored by every team in history and their numbers of singles, doubles, triples, homers, walks, and outs, as well as occurrences like double plays and sac bunts, it's fairly straightforward to come up with estimates of how many runs each event is usually worth. My go-to estimator, called extrapolated runs, assigns these values, and they're usually impressively accurate. However, as you can see, there's still some room for error around the trend. Take a look at those pennant-winning Cardinals. And there's a bit more when it comes to the runs allowed by individual pitchers than there is for entire lineups. Here's the same chart for 2013 for every starting pitcher with over 100 innings pitched. It's still quite good, but a bit worse. Moreover, while we have very good reason to assume that the order of events is random for lineups, since they're made up of 9 different people, it's much more likely that specific pitchers can affect the sequence of plays while they're on the mound, either by changing their approach to hitters with the men on base, or by preventing guys who do reach from advancing. You can squeeze out a little extra accuracy by using a more flexible run estimator known as base runs, which can incorporate such particularities. Nonetheless, just like BABIP, strand rate, the share of base runners that fail to score, was a variable that most forecasting systems assumed was random, but might have some real skill lurking underneath. To investigate this possibility, I first calculated a runner holding score for every pitcher in every season since 2002. I used the extrapolated runs values for stolen bases, 0.18, and for caught stealing and pickoffs, minus 0.5, to get the following ratio. That means for the break-even rate for base stealers was about 73.5% using these numbers, which is roughly in line with most prevailing estimates. I then performed the same analysis on these hold rates that I did with all the other pitching variables, although I adjusted for the fact that righties and lefties hold runners at different rates. It turns out that runner holding is pretty noisy and slow decaying. It's fairly close to wild pitches on the chart. But once you get a few years of data, you can be somewhat confident in your forecasts, particularly when it comes to southpaws. Of course, it's not fair to give pitchers all the credit for opposing base runners' performance, since catchers have a lot of influence as well. But the cliche that bases are stolen off the pitcher, not the catcher, actually holds up pretty well. First of all, catchers have nothing to do with pickoffs. This was supposed to be a video of Mark Burley picking off a helpless runner, but PowerPoint doesn't like it, sorry. Which account for a significant chunk of runner holding value. And even considering stolen base success rates, if you look at the most this slide doesn't look good, but if you look at the most prolific runner holders of the past decade, as well as the guys it's been easiest to run wild on, it really doesn't matter who's catching. The good ones are good no matter who they're throwing to, and the bad ones are just plain bad. After coming up with projections for each pitcher's runner holding skill, the simplest thing would have just been to add those onto my prior expectations for their runs allowed and see if it improved my accuracy. But just out of curiosity, I decided to plot those projections against my errors, the gaps between how many runs base runs had forecast the pitchers to surrender and how many runs they actually did, in order to visualize the relationship. On first glance, it came out just as expected, with a lot of noise but a positive slope. But when I actually looked at the underlying trend equation, I found something baffling. I would have expected something close to a 1-to-1 ratio. Pitchers forecast to save 1 run via runner holding should outperform their projections by roughly 1 run. Instead, this multiplier came out at 2.74. In other words, runner holding was providing 2.74 times as much information and 2.74 times as much predictive power as it should have. I had to rescale the graph to really understand what I was looking at. To be sure, the impact of this variable on the overall accuracy was modest. Across the whole data set, the correlation coefficient rose by only 0.01, while the root mean square error fell by just from 86 to 85. However, the effect was highly concentrated at the extremes. The new equation was completely indistinguishable from the old one in projecting pitchers whose running holding skill was close to average, and far, far superior at projecting the previously baffling outliers. Among players who were forecast for a runner holding score at least 1.5 standard deviations from the mean, the correlation between forecast and results improved from 0.53 to 0.6, and the root mean square error fell from 0.89 to 0.86. For this subset of players, the ones for whom we have real information about their runner holding skill, the factor turned the smart money around entirely. Stat-savvy fantasy owners used to scoff at the teams that paid up for the draft for the supposedly unsustainable ERAs of pitchers like Mark Burley or the late career Tom Gravin, and smirk after scooping out of the bargain bin guys whose results tended to lag their FIP, like Kevin Millwood. In fact, it seems that the former group was undervalued and the latter overpriced. And the logic applies to real-world teams. How good does Burley's 4-year, $56 million deal look in hindsight? Just as much as it does to fantasy players. The key question these results leave unanswered is whether this multiplier is real, in which case runner holding must itself be correlated to some other ability, skill, or source of value that projection systems are not considering, or just a statistical blip. The simplest hypothesis would be that keeping runners close does more than just prevent steals and generate pickoffs and caught stealings. It also makes it harder for guys to move up on groundouts, stay out of double plays, and take the extra base on hits. How much of a difference does this make? For groundouts and double plays, the sign does point in the right direction, but the relationship is rather weak. The news is even worse on scoring from first on doubles, where there's no connection at all. But reaching third on a single, fortunately, yields real rewards. For every run a pitcher projects to save via runner holding, that's about every 2 expected pickoffs, they can also get 0.8 fewer advances from first to third on hits. Taken together, these 3 factors augment the value of preventing steals and racking up caught stealings and pickoffs by 43%. That cuts back our mystery variance from 60, this pie chart didn't come out, I don't know why. But this cuts back our mystery variance from 64% of the total accounted for by runner holding to 48%. Unfortunately, that 48% is still a big fat question mark. I then tested to see if the skill had any relationship with my other projection variables. One particularly intuitive hypothesis was that good runner holders, by virtue of their paying attention to the non-pitching aspects of their position, were also more likely to be good fielders and thus allow a below-average BABIP. Mark Burley is famous as an excellent fielder as well as a great pickoff move. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to detect any relationship between the skill and over-under performance relative to expectation in any other component. The multiplier is entirely a product of the strand rate, nothing more. This leaves us with 2 possibilities. One is that guys with good pickoff moves are somehow able to pitch out of a jam at an above-average rate for reasons we're not yet able to determine. The other, of course, is that it's mere statistical noise. Steals, caught stealings, and pickoffs are rare and inconsistent, and strand rates do bounce around wildly for no good reason. As a result, all we can say with 95% confidence is that the multiplier lies somewhere between 0.81 and 4.66. There's still a chance, however slight, that the quote-unquote extra weight will disappear as we get more data. But if the range is still that wide after my 12-year study, we'll be waiting a very long time before we get a more reliable answer. And by that point, the game may evolve in ways that make the old numbers no longer relevant. What we really need is more and bigger outliers so we can get more meaningful data points and conduct more powerful studies. So if there's anyone here from a major league team that's intrigued by this finding, please go tell your general manager to give some guys with great pickoff moves a shot. If I'm onto something, their performance will probably exceed your expectations and their paychecks. In particular, I'd like to make a plea to the Texas Rangers to give a long audition to Ryan Fearabend. A little-known journeyman. Oh, that slide didn't come out. Damn it. A little-known journeyman who was briefly the best runner holder of modern times. As a child, he worked on his move with his father 3 days a week. Coming up through the minors from 2003 to 2006, we know of 39 runners who tried to steal on him. 3 were safe. After he was promoted to the majors in 2006, he threw a total of 106 innings, in which he racked up 8 caught stealings and 6 pickoffs against just 1 successful stolen base. Fierben then underwent Tommy John surgery and has since been clawing his way up the minors. Last year, he had a .370 ERA between Double and Triple A. As a soft-tossing 27-year-old, Fierben's no one's idea of a prospect. But at the very least, he'd provide evidence of whether a killer pickoff move is enough by itself to survive in the majors, and he's a heck of a lot cheaper with Mark Burley. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. And sorry about the slides.
All right, we have time for some questions. Yeah.
Yes.
1 second here. Let me get you this mic.
The 2.74 coefficient, did you actually compute any kind of confidence interval T-statistic?
Yes, I did. I showed it. Yes.
Okay, what?
It was 8.81 to 4.66. That's what I'm saying. It's a very wide range.
Right. So, yeah. So there could actually be no effect. It could
There
just
could
be
be no-
one.
yes.
It could just be one, and you just got a little...
Well, it's more likely to be 1.4 than 1. Yes, the problem is that these events are so infrequent that we need more teams or more players or bigger outliers, as I said. But there's a perfectly plausible chance that this will evaporate as time goes on. But it's a big number, so yeah.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Going once. All right, please
Thank you very much.
join me in giving him a round of applause. Thank you.